So what are we gonna do now? First, we're gonna pick a limited palette. So what does a limited palette means? I think for this classic, it just means a palette consists of less than 10 colors, including black and white. Now you may think that sounds like a lot, but if you really did the exercise we just did, like color picking other artists' work, you'll notice like in the painterly work, there are over thousands of colors. And in the graphic work, usually there's like more than 10 as well. So I think 10 color is a pretty good place to start to have a good selection of color in different hues and values and saturation. And we will build upon that to have like a second generation of colors that's being generated from the first set of swatches that we took from other people. So now let's talk about what kind of art would be good for this exercise. This is the sketch that I prepared for this class. I think it's a good idea to pick something a little bit simpler so we can really focus on the colors and not get confused by the complexity of the image. So in this one, we have a clear foreground, a clear hero, which is the girl. And then we have a middle ground, the tree with a bird in it, and a background, which is just the sky. Pretty simple hierarchy and three major elements that we're working with. Before we really get into color, I just want to talk a little bit about color mode because that was something really confusing for myself and maybe confusing for you as well. So color mode can be changed here. Mostly we work with two color mode. One is RGB and one is CMYK. RGB is the mixing of color light, red, green, and blue, and that's how monitors display the colors. And the CMYK is a four-color separation that's being used by industrial printing. So C is cyan, which is blue, M is magenta, which is red, Y is yellow, which is yellow, K is black, because in the back of the days when the colors would actually like etch into plate, the black is called a key plate. That's why now it's K, CMYK. We should also take a look at the color setting because you realize that within RGB and CMYK, there are different working spaces as well. And this is probably the most confusing part. Here, right now, we're at sRGB, which is the default setting for most monitors, most cameras, and most internet browsers. And if you go down, open this up, you see there's other options, many other options. So another common one is Adobe RGB. Adobe RGB has a wider range of color display, around like 35% more than sRGB. And you might think more is better. In some case, yes. Because it has more colors, it's able to be more color accurate if you print a piece with the Adobe RGB setting. But when you try to show your work online, the color tend to get duller and muted because the internet browsers is unable to read all this color in Adobe RGB. So I think for this project, if you're thinking of mostly showing off your work in our, classroom share or on Instagram or, online, then sRGB is probably the way to go. But if you are wanting to print it out, for example, with a nice Epson stylus printer, then Adobe RGB is the way to go. If you are going to mass produce this and send it to press, then CMYK is the way to go. And this is a pretty commonly used working space for CMYK. Now we have it set to RGB. I will just pick the one for the web. Here I have a finished line drawing that was based on my sketch. As you can tell, it's pretty close. I always think it's important to spend more time with your sketch because it's a quick way to fix any composition problem before you get into the finished line drawing. The last thing you want is to spend like hours on the drawing and then realize that the whole thing has a very weak composition foundation. So here we are, and what I like to do before adding color is to just create flats. And if that's not familiar with you, flats are essentially how comic artists work. It just means shapes of flat color, not the final color, just like a placeholder for each major element. So then the color of that element can easily be changed. So the lasso tool is something I use a lot. I use a magnetic one as well because right now the contrast is pretty high, so it's pretty easy to select. So what is the magnetic lasso does is that it sort of snaps to places with high contrast. So as you can see here, I am loosely following the guideline and it kind of snapped into place. It's not going to be 100% accurate, but we can always go back and fix it later. It's just a quick way to make the flats as opposed to using the regular lasso tool because then you have to be like super steady with your hand. And having that magnetic snapping allows shaky hands. And then we just open a new layer and fill that color. Now, when you fill the color, you don't want to use like really crazy like neon green or blue or magenta because that's gonna kind of mess up your color judgment. So I tend to stay in the neutral. And maybe if you have colors that you already know you want to use sort of in that range. And I always like to organize my layers in folders here. So then when you get a lot of different layers, they won't be super confusing. So here we have this layer filled. And then you just kind of go on. So as you can see, like here I already make the selection. Now I'm just adding color to it so I can read which layer is which. And at this point, it really doesn't matter what color you put. Like I can have a gray tree. It doesn't mean you have to stay gray. It's just easy for yourself to distinguish one part of the image from another part of the image. So here I'm pretty much done with most of the big shapes. You can see with the women here, I broke it down into 3 parts. The dress here, the body here, and the hair. Right now the tree is still, the leaf is just one part with the branch as the second part and then the bird on top. So now go ahead and pick a piece of work from yourself that shares similar quality with the example I just said, simpler shape, clear foreground, middle ground, and background. And then we'll dive into the colors.